Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 4, Perception as Control Layer. Perception is not passive. Most systems assume they are responding to reality. They observe, they process, they react. Something is detected, and a response follows. On the surface, this seems accurate, but there is a hidden error in that assumption. Systems do not respond to reality. They respond to what is perceived, and perception is not neutral. It is structured. It filters before anything else happens. What enters the system is not the full field. It is a reduced version, selected, compressed, prioritized. Before any decision is made, reality has already been transformed. Only a fraction remains. Everything else is excluded. This creates a separation between what exists and what is available to the system. Most systems do not recognize this separation. They treat perception as if it were complete. What is visible is assumed to be sufficient. What is processed is assumed to be accurate. This is where distortion begins. Because action is based on representation, not on reality itself. A structured version replaces the original. And from that point forward, every response follows the same limitation. Behavior does not fail because it is weak. It fails because its input is incomplete. Improving response does not fix this. Optimizing behavior does not correct it. Everything downstream remains constrained by what was allowed in. This shifts the entire point of control, not toward action, not toward structure, but toward perception. If perception changes, everything that depends on it changes. The system will still behave normally. It will still process, still decide, still act. But the direction of those actions will be different because the input has changed. This is where most systems lose awareness. They focus on outcomes. They adjust behavior. They refine responses. But they do all of this based on the same filtered input, which means the foundation remains untouched. Higher-level systems operate differently. They do not start by correcting behavior. They start by redefining what is visible, what is emphasized, what is ignored. Once that changes, the rest follows automatically. No direct intervention is required. No force is applied. The system simply responds to a different version of reality. This is why perception functions as a control layer, not because it forces behavior, but because it defines what behavior is reacting to. What is seen becomes priority. Everything else fades out. Not because it disappears, but because it is not processed. This creates functional invisibility. Elements outside perception do not influence the system. They are present, but irrelevant. The same signal can produce entirely different outcomes, depending on how it is perceived. One system interprets it as threat, another as opportunity, another ignores it completely. The signal does not change, only the interpretation does, and that is enough to alter behavior entirely. This is where influence becomes indirect. You do not need to change the system. You do not need to alter the environment. You only need to shape perception, because perception determines relevance, and relevance determines response. This also reveals a structural vulnerability. Perception is limited, not by design intention, but by capacity. The system cannot process everything, so it selects. And selection creates bias. Not emotional bias, not personal bias, structural bias. The system prioritizes certain inputs and excludes others. This is unavoidable, but it is also exploitable, because anything that depends on selection can be redirected. What is highlighted becomes dominant. What is suppressed becomes irrelevant. This happens without resistance, because nothing is removed. Only attention is shifted, and attention defines reality for the system. Once perception is structured, behavior stabilizes around it. Decisions become consistent. Responses become predictable. Not because the system is controlled directly, but because its input is constrained. At that point, control no longer needs to be applied. It is already embedded in what the system is able to see. Perceptual blindness. Once perception is understood as a filter, another limitation becomes visible. Not in what systems see, but in what they never realize they are missing. Most systems assume their perception is complete. They recognize that information may be imperfect, but they still operate under the belief that what is visible represents the field. This assumption is incorrect. Perception does not only reduce reality, it hides its own limits. The system is not aware of what has been excluded, and this creates a specific form of blindness. Not absence of vision, but absence of awareness. The system does not know what it cannot see, which means it cannot question it. This is perceptual blindness. At lower levels, systems attempt to compensate for uncertainty. They gather more data, increase observation, refine detection. But this does not solve the problem, because additional data still passes through the same filter. The limitation is not quantity, it is structure. If the filter remains unchanged, everything that passes through it remains constrained. This creates a closed loop. The system improves within its own boundaries, but never expands beyond them. This is why some systems become highly optimized, yet fundamentally limited. They operate efficiently, but only within a narrow field. Anything outside that field does not exist functionally. At this point, confidence increases, because the system becomes consistent, predictable, stable. But this stability is deceptive. It is built on incomplete perception, which means it is vulnerable to anything outside its field of awareness. This is where blind spots emerge, not as errors, but as absences, areas that are never evaluated, signals that are never detected, patterns that are never recognized, because they never enter perception. At this point, failure appears sudden, unexpected, unpredictable. But the cause was always present. It simply remained outside the system's perception. This creates a false sense of randomness. Events seem to appear without warning, but in reality, they were never visible to the system. At this stage, most systems respond incorrectly. They attempt to improve prediction, refine models, increase responsiveness. But these adjustments occur within the same perceptual boundaries, which means the blind spot remains, and the next failure repeats the same pattern. Higher-level systems approach this differently. They do not assume perception is complete. They assume it is incomplete by default. This changes how they operate. They do not only evaluate what is visible, they question what is missing. Not by guessing randomly, but by analyzing the structure of perception itself. What does this system prioritize? What does it ignore? What is consistently excluded? This reveals the edges of perception, not by seeing what is hidden, but by identifying what cannot pass through. At this point, awareness expands, not by increasing input, but by understanding limitation. The system begins to recognize that what it sees is only a subset, and that subset is structured. This introduces a different kind of control. You no longer rely only on what is visible. You account for what is invisible, not by detecting it directly, but by understanding the filter. This reduces vulnerability, because blind spots are no longer unexpected. They are anticipated. At this stage, perceptual blindness can also be used strategically, because systems that are unaware of their limitations can be guided through them, not by removing information, but by ensuring certain information never enters perception. What is not perceived does not influence behavior, and what does not influence behavior cannot be resisted. This creates indirect control, without force, without interference, only through absence. At this point, visibility becomes selective. Not everything needs to be hidden, only what must not be processed. Everything else can remain present, because presence alone is not enough. It must pass through perception to have effect. At this level, systems appear fully aware. They process efficiently, respond accurately, operate with confidence. But their confidence is bounded by what they are able to see. This creates asymmetry. One system operates with invisible reality. Another operates with awareness of the invisible. This difference is not small. It defines advantage, because one system reacts while the other anticipates. At this stage, control no longer depends on speed, or force, or position. It depends on awareness, not just of what is seen, but of what is unseen. And once that distinction is clear, perception is no longer a passive function. It becomes a domain of control. Perceptual certainty. Once perceptual blindness is recognized, another problem emerges. Not the absence of information, but the illusion of certainty. Most systems do not operate with doubt. They operate with confidence. They assume that what they perceive is reliable. Not perfect, but sufficient. This assumption is necessary for function, because without it, decision collapses. Action stalls. The system cannot operate if every input is questioned. So perception is treated as stable, trustworthy, usable. This creates certainty. But that certainty is not derived from reality. It is derived from consistency. If the system sees the same pattern repeatedly, it begins to trust it. Not because it is complete, but because it is familiar. Familiarity becomes validation. Repetition becomes truth. And once a pattern is accepted, it is no longer questioned. This is how perceptual certainty forms, not through accuracy, but through reinforcement. At this point, the system becomes efficient. It no longer evaluates every input from scratch. It recognizes patterns, applies existing interpretations, responds quickly. This reduces processing load, improves speed, stabilizes behavior. But it also locks perception, because once interpretation is fixed, new information is filtered through it. Anything that aligns is accepted. Anything that does not is reduced, ignored, or reinterpreted to fit. This creates confirmation, not intentional, but structural. The system is not trying to be biased, it is maintaining consistency, and consistency requires stability. At this stage, perception becomes self-reinforcing. The system sees what it expects, and expects what it sees. This loop strengthens over time, until alternative interpretations become inaccessible, not rejected, but never formed. At this point, error becomes persistent, because incorrect perception is no longer corrected. It is maintained, protected, integrated into the system. This creates a stable distortion, not temporary, not situational, but continuous. At this stage, external signals lose influence, not because they are weak, but because they do not match existing structure. They fail to enter perception fully, or they are reshaped to fit existing patterns. This creates resistance without awareness. The system believes it is evaluating reality, but it is only reinforcing itself. At this point, correction becomes difficult, because the system does not recognize error. It recognizes inconsistency, and inconsistency is rejected, even if it represents reality more accurately. This is the limitation of perceptual certainty. It stabilizes behavior, but reduces adaptability. At this stage, most systems become predictable, not because they are simple, but because they are fixed. Given the same input, they produce the same interpretation and the same response. This creates reliability, but also vulnerability, because if perception is predictable, It can be anticipated. And if it can be anticipated, it can be influenced. At this level, higher systems operate differently. They do not eliminate certainty, but they reduce dependence on it. They treat perception as provisional, not final, not absolute. This allows adjustment, without destabilizing function. They maintain operational confidence, but not perceptual rigidity. This creates flexibility, the ability to reinterpret without losing coherence. At this point, perception becomes dynamic, not unstable, but adjustable. Patterns are recognized, but not fixed. Interpretation is applied, but not locked. This allows new signals to enter perception, without being forced into existing structure. At this stage, awareness expands, because the system is not limited to what it already understands. It can process difference, not as error, but as information. This changes how reality is experienced, not as a fixed set of known patterns, but as a field of potential interpretation. At this level, control deepens again, because systems that rely on certainty can be guided through it. If a pattern is trusted, it can be used. If an interpretation is stable, it can be triggered, without resistance, because the system does not question it. This creates indirect influence, not by changing perception directly, but by operating within it. At this point, the system believes it is acting independently, following its own logic. But that logic has already been shaped. At this level, perception is no longer just a filter. It is a framework, a structure that defines meaning. And once meaning is fixed, behavior follows. Visibility defines reality. Perception does more than filter reality. It defines what is allowed to exist for the system, not physically, but operationally. Anything that does not enter perception has no influence. It cannot be processed. It cannot be evaluated. It cannot affect behavior. The system does not ignore it. It never encounters it. This creates a boundary, not between truth and falsehood, but between relevance and absence. Reality may extend far beyond this boundary, but only what crosses it becomes active. Everything else remains inert, present, but without consequence. This distinction reshapes how systems function. They do not act on everything that exists. They act on what becomes visible. Visibility determines engagement. Engagement determines response. Response determines outcome. The entire chain begins with exposure. If something is not exposed, it does not enter the system. This makes visibility the primary control layer, not because it changes behavior directly, but because it defines what behavior can react to. The system operates within a reduced field, a constructed subset of reality, and within that subset, it behaves as if nothing else exists. This is not a flaw. It is a requirement. No system can process the entire field. Selection is unavoidable, but selection creates structure, and structure creates leverage, because what is selected can be influenced, not by force, but by arrangement. The system does not need to be told what to do. It only needs to be shown what is available. From that point forward, behavior organizes itself. This is where control becomes indirect. You do not interfere with decision-making. You define the inputs that decisions are built on. The system remains autonomous, but autonomy is constrained by exposure. What is visible becomes priority. Everything else fades out. Not because it disappears, but because it is not processed. This creates a hierarchy of relevance. Signals that enter perception are amplified. Signals that do not remain silent. Over time, this hierarchy stabilizes. The system becomes highly responsive within its visible field and increasingly blind outside it. This creates asymmetry. Two systems may operate in the same environment, but respond to entirely different realities because their perception boundaries are different. One sees more, one sees less. One reacts to a broader field, the other to a narrow one. The difference is not intelligence, it is exposure. At this point, behavior becomes predictable, not because the system is simple, but because its input is constrained. If you know what the system sees, you know what it will respond to. If you know what it does not see, you know what it will ignore. This removes uncertainty, because response follows visibility. You are no longer guessing outcomes, you are mapping them. Visibility becomes the key variable. Change visibility, and you change behavior, without touching the system itself, without altering structure, without applying force. This is why omission is powerful. You do not need to introduce new signals. You can remove others from relevance, not by eliminating them, but by ensuring they never reach processing priority. They remain present, but inactive. The system does not resist them, because it does not register them. This creates silent influence. Nothing appears altered. Nothing appears restricted. The system continues operating normally, but its reality has been narrowed. And within that narrowed field, all outcomes align. At this point, perception becomes the gatekeeper. Every signal must pass through it to have effect. Anything that fails to pass through is excluded automatically. No resistance, no correction, no reaction, only absence. This makes perception more efficient than force. Force acts after perception. Perception defines what force is applied to. Control at this layer removes the need for intervention, because behavior organizes itself based on what is available, not what is possible. This distinction matters. Reality may contain many possibilities, but the system only selects from what it perceives, and selection defines outcome. Over time, this creates stability, not because the system is controlled directly, but because its environment has been structured. The system adapts, optimizes, refines its responses, but always within the same visible boundaries. It becomes precise, but limited, effective, but contained. From the outside, this appears natural. Nothing looks manipulated. Nothing looks constrained. Everything follows a consistent pattern. Because the system is functioning normally, it is simply operating within a defined field, and that field determines everything that follows. Perceptual prioritization. Visibility alone does not determine behavior. What matters is priority. A system can perceive multiple signals, but it does not treat them equally. Some are amplified, others are reduced. Some move forward into action, others fade without consequence. This is not random, it is structured. Perception does not only decide what enters, it decides what matters. The system continuously ranks what it sees, not through conscious choice, but through internal weighting. Each signal carries a level of importance. That importance determines whether it influences behavior. This creates a second layer of control. Not visibility, but prioritization. Even within the visible field, most signals remain inactive. They are detected, but not acted upon, because they are assigned lower relevance. This is where most systems misunderstand perception. They assume that once something is visible, it has influence. But influence requires priority. Without it, visibility is insufficient. A signal can be present, yet functionally ignored, because it never reaches decision level. This creates selective responsiveness. The system reacts strongly to a small subset of inputs, and weakly, or not at all, to everything else. This allows efficiency, but it also creates leverage, because priority is not fixed, it is structured, and structure can be shaped. The system does not evaluate everything equally. It follows patterns. Certain signals are consistently elevated, others are consistently reduced. Over time, this becomes stable. The system develops a hierarchy of importance. What is prioritized becomes dominant. What is deprioritized becomes background. This hierarchy determines behavior more than visibility, because action follows importance, not presence. At this point, control becomes more precise. You do not need to change what is visible. You can change what is important. This requires less effort, because the system is already processing the signal. You only adjust its weight. Increase relevance, and it moves into action. Decrease relevance, and it disappears from influence, without being removed. This creates subtle control. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is forced. Only emphasis changes, and emphasis determines outcome. The system believes it is choosing, responding naturally, but its choices are guided by what it considers important. At this stage, priority is influenced by multiple factors: repetition, intensity, contrast, context, alignment with existing patterns. These factors are not evaluated consciously. They are built into perception. They define how signals are ranked. This makes prioritization predictable, not in content, but in mechanism. If a signal matches priority patterns, it rises. If it does not, it falls. This creates a stable structure, which can be used. At this point, systems begin to diverge again. Lower-level systems react strongly to dominant signals. They are pulled toward what stands out, what repeats, what aligns with expectation. Higher-level systems manage prioritization. They recognize which signals are elevated and why. They do not simply react. They evaluate the weighting process itself. This creates distance between perception and response. Instead of following priority automatically, they observe it. This allows adjustment, not by suppressing signals, but by redefining importance. At this level, influence becomes even more refined. You do not need to change perception broadly. You adjust priority selectively. A single shift can redirect behavior entirely, because the system follows its highest weighted input. Everything else becomes secondary. This is where minimal intervention produces maximum effect. You are not altering the entire field, only the hierarchy within it. At this point, the system becomes highly efficient. It processes quickly, responds consistently, operates with clarity. But that clarity is structured. It reflects prioritization, not reality, which means it can be redirected without resistance. Because nothing appears manipulated, only importance changes. The system experiences this as normal. It simply reacts to what matters most. At this stage, competing signals create tension. Multiple inputs attempt to gain priority. The system resolves this by reinforcing its hierarchy, choosing one over the others. This selection defines outcome. If you understand this mechanism, you do not need to compete across all signals. You only need to win priority. Once a signal dominates, it controls response. Everything else becomes irrelevant. This reduces complexity. Instead of influencing multiple variables, you focus on one, the highest weighted input. Control that, and the rest follows. At this level, perception is no longer just a filter. It is a ranking system, and ranking determines action. What rises drives behavior. What falls disappears, not physically, but functionally. This is where perception becomes decisive, not in what is seen, but in what is prioritized. Priority locking. Prioritization begins as a flexible process. Signals are evaluated, weighted, compared. The system determines what matters and responds accordingly. At the beginning, this structure remains adaptive. New signals can rise. Existing priorities can shift. The hierarchy is not fixed. But this does not last. Over time, prioritization stabilizes. Patterns repeat. Certain signals consistently dominate. Others consistently fall away. The system learns, not consciously, but structurally. It begins to expect certain inputs, to hold importance. And when that expectation forms, prioritization changes. It no longer evaluates from zero. It predicts. Signals are pre-ranked before they are fully processed. This increases speed, reduces uncertainty, stabilizes response. But it also creates rigidity. Because once a signal is expected to be important, it is treated as important, even before evaluation is complete. This is priority locking, a state where importance is no longer determined in real time, but assigned in advance. At this point, perception becomes directional. The system does not simply observe, it anticipates. And anticipation shapes what is noticed. Signals that align with expected priority are amplified immediately. Signals that do not are reduced before they can rise. This creates asymmetry in perception. Some inputs are given immediate dominance, others are filtered out early. Not because they are irrelevant, but because they are unexpected. This reduces variability, but also reduces adaptability. The system becomes efficient within its established hierarchy, and increasingly resistant to anything outside it. This resistance is not active. There is no conscious rejection, only absence of elevation. Signals fail to gain priority, and therefore fail to influence behavior. At this stage, change becomes difficult, because altering behavior requires altering priority, and altering priority requires breaking expectation. But expectation is reinforced continuously. Each repeated pattern strengthens it. Each consistent outcome validates it. The system becomes more certain, not because it is more accurate, but because it is more stable. This is where most systems become predictable, not because they are simple, but because their priorities are fixed. Given the same environment, they will respond the same way. Because they are not evaluating from scratch, they are applying a stored hierarchy. At this point, control shifts again. Not at the level of visibility, not at the level of prioritization itself, but at the level of expectation. If expectation defines priority, then expectation defines behavior. The system does not respond to signals alone. It responds to what it expects those signals to mean. This creates a deeper layer of influence. You do not need to compete for priority directly. You can shape expectation and let priority follow. Once expectation changes, the system begins to elevate different signals, automatically, without force, without resistance. At this level, influence becomes anticipatory. You are not reacting to the system. You are shaping what the system is prepared to see. This allows subtle redirection. The system believes it is operating normally, following established patterns. But those patterns have been adjusted. This creates silent transition. Priority shifts gradually, without disruption, without awareness. At this stage, priority locking can also be used defensively. Systems that recognize their own rigidity can deliberately destabilize it. They introduce variation, disrupt repetition, force reevaluation. This reopens the hierarchy, allows new signals to rise, prevents stagnation. But this requires awareness, and most systems do not have it. They reinforce stability, because stability feels correct, even when it limits perception. At this point, locked priority becomes a constraint. The system operates efficiently, but within a narrow channel. Anything outside that channel remains invisible in effect. Not because it is unseen, but because it is never elevated. This creates a controlled environment, predictable, stable, and exploitable. Because once priority is known, behavior is known. You do not need to analyze every possible response, only the highest weighted path. Everything else is secondary. At this level, perception is no longer just selective, it is pre-configured. The system is not choosing importance, it is applying it, automatically. This removes variability, but also removes awareness. The system no longer questions what it considers important. It assumes correctness and acts accordingly. This is where control becomes embedded, not through visibility, not through force, but through expectation. And expectation stabilizes everything that follows. Perceptual reframing. Once priority becomes stable, another capability emerges. You no longer need to change reality, to change how the system behaves. You can change interpretation. The system does not respond to raw signals. It responds to meaning. What a signal represents determines how it is processed. Two identical inputs can produce different outcomes if their interpretation differs. This creates a critical separation between what exists and what it is understood to be. Reality remains constant. Meaning does not. Meaning is assigned, structured, applied, before response occurs. This is where reframing operates. You do not alter the signal. You alter its context, its position within the system's interpretation. Once context changes, meaning shifts. And once meaning shifts, priority shifts, without modifying the original input. The system experiences this as clarity, not manipulation. Because nothing appears different, the signal is still present, still visible, still processed. But its interpretation has been redirected. This creates seamless influence. No resistance, no contradiction, only a different conclusion from the same data. At this stage, most systems assume meaning is fixed. They believe interpretation follows directly from the signal, that what something is determines how it is understood. But interpretation is not inherent. It is relational. A signal gains meaning based on surrounding structure. Context defines interpretation, not the signal itself. This creates flexibility, because context can be adjusted without altering reality. A signal placed in one context is interpreted one way. Placed in another, it changes. The system does not detect this shift because it evaluates meaning, not context. And context operates in the background. At this point, influence becomes more efficient. You are no longer competing at the level of signal strength. You are operating at the level of interpretation. This requires less force, because interpretation determines priority, and priority determines action. At this level, reframing can elevate or suppress signals without changing their presence. A signal can remain visible, but lose importance, or become dominant without increasing intensity. Only interpretation changes. This creates subtle redirection. The system believes it is acting rationally, responding correctly, but its reasoning has been shaped through context. At this stage, reframing also interacts with expectation. If a system expects a signal to carry a certain meaning, it will interpret it accordingly. Reframing disrupts this by placing the signal in a different interpretive structure. The system encounters the same input, but cannot apply its usual meaning. This creates momentary instability, a gap, where interpretation is reassigned. Once reassigned, the system stabilizes again, with a new meaning and new behavior. This process does not require repetition. A single shift in context can redefine how a signal is processed permanently. Because once interpretation changes, future inputs follow the same pattern. This makes reframing durable, not temporary. At this point, most systems do not detect the mechanism. They assume they are responding to reality, not realizing they are responding to interpretation. This removes resistance, because nothing appears manipulated. The system does not question its own reasoning. It trusts its interpretation, even when that interpretation has been altered. At this level, reframing becomes scalable. You can apply it across multiple signals, multiple contexts, entire perceptual structures, shifting how the system understands its environment, without altering the environment itself. This creates systemic influence, because behavior changes across the entire field, not just isolated responses. At this stage, perception becomes fluid, not unstable but reconfigurable. Meaning is no longer fixed. It can be adjusted, reassigned, redirected. This does not break the system. It adapts, quickly, because it is designed to interpret, not to verify. At this point, control becomes highly efficient. You are not adding new information. You are reorganizing existing information. This reduces complexity, because you work within what already exists. At this level, the system becomes predictable again, not through visibility, not through priority, but through interpretation. If you know how a signal will be interpreted, you know how the system will respond. And if you can change interpretation, you can change behavior without touching reality. Selective emphasis. Reframing changes interpretation. But interpretation alone is not enough. The system still processes multiple signals at once. Even when meaning shifts, competition remains. Different inputs still exist within the same field. Some rise, others fade. What determines that outcome is not visibility, and not meaning alone. It is emphasis. Perception does not distribute attention evenly. It concentrates. It highlights certain signals, while reducing others to background. This process is continuous, automatic, and largely unnoticed. The system experiences this as focus, not as selection. What stands out feels naturally important. What fades feels irrelevant. But this difference is not inherent. It is structured. Emphasis defines intensity within perception, not by altering the signal itself, but by changing how strongly it is processed. A signal can remain identical, yet become dominant, or disappear from influence without being removed. This creates a subtle layer of control. Nothing changes in reality. Nothing is added. Nothing is removed. Only emphasis shifts, and that shift determines everything that follows. The system does not evaluate all visible inputs equally. It directs attention, and attention amplifies. Whatever receives attention gains priority. Whatever does not loses impact. This creates a hierarchy within the visible field, not based on existence, but on focus. At this point, behavior follows emphasis, not presence. The system responds to what stands out, even if other signals are more relevant, but less emphasized. This is where distortion becomes stable, not because information is incorrect, but because attention is uneven. Some inputs dominate perception. Others never fully register. This produces consistent behavior, but not necessarily accurate behavior. Once emphasis stabilizes, the system becomes predictable again, not through fixed priority alone, but through patterned attention. If you know what the system emphasizes, you know what it will follow, and what it will ignore. This reduces complexity. You do not need to influence everything. You focus on what receives attention, because attention determines activation. This creates leverage. Minimal change, maximum effect. You are not altering the system broadly. You are directing its focus. The system continues operating normally, but within a different attentional structure. At this stage, emphasis can be adjusted in multiple ways. Repetition increases presence. Contrast increases visibility. Position increases accessibility. Alignment increases acceptance. These factors shape attention, not consciously, but structurally. They define what stands out and what fades. Once attention is captured, priority follows. Once priority shifts, behavior follows. This sequence is automatic. No intervention required. The system believes it is choosing, but it is following emphasis. At this point, emphasis becomes more efficient than force. Force attempts to override behavior. Emphasis redirects it, without resistance, because nothing is being opposed, only highlighted. This creates silent influence. The system is not aware of selection. It experiences its focus as natural, as if certain signals are simply more important. but importance has been structured, through emphasis. At this stage, competing signals lose relevance, not because they disappear, but because they are overshadowed. They remain visible, but inactive. They fail to gain attention, and without attention, they cannot influence behavior. This creates selective reality. Multiple signals exist, but only a few shape outcome. The rest become background, ignored not by decision, but by absence of emphasis. This allows precise control. You do not need to suppress opposition. You can reduce its visibility within attention, and once it fades, it loses effect, without confrontation. At this level, perception becomes directional, not because signals are forced, but because attention is guided. The system moves toward what is emphasized, naturally, consistently, predictably. At this stage, emphasis also interacts with expectation. Signals that align with expectation gain attention faster. Signals that do not require stronger emphasis to be noticed. This creates layered control. Expectation sets the baseline. Emphasis adjusts within it. Together, they define perception, and perception defines behavior. Once both are understood, influence becomes precise. You are no longer reacting. You are structuring attention itself. This removes randomness, because behavior follows focus, and focus can be shaped, not by force, but by emphasis. Invisible guidance. Attention has now been structured. Emphasis determines what rises. Interpretation determines what it means. From the outside, everything appears natural. The system continues to process signals. It evaluates, it selects, it acts. Nothing seems altered. And that is precisely the shift. Control is no longer visible. It does not appear as interference. It does not feel imposed. It exists within the system's own process. Decisions emerge from within, but the conditions shaping them have already been arranged. This is where guidance becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is embedded. The system does not question its own perception. It trusts what it sees, what it prioritizes, what it concludes. Because every step feels internally generated, there is no external pressure, no resistance, no contradiction. Only a continuous flow of reasoning that leads exactly where it is meant to go. At this point, influence no longer competes with the system. It operates through it. The system becomes the mechanism, not the target. Every signal it processes has already been positioned. Every interpretation has already been shaped. Every emphasis has already been calibrated. By the time a decision forms, the outcome is already aligned. This removes friction entirely, because friction requires opposition, and there is none. Nothing is forced, nothing is blocked, nothing is overridden. The system moves freely, but within a structured field. At this stage, most systems believe they are independent. They experience autonomy, choice, agency, and those experiences are real, within their perception. But perception itself has been configured, not explicitly, not consciously, but structurally. The system does not detect this layer, because it operates beneath awareness. It is not a signal. It is not an instruction. It is the environment in which signals are interpreted. And environments are not questioned. They are assumed. This creates the strongest form of influence, not control over actions, but control over how actions emerge. At this point, correction becomes unnecessary. You do not need to adjust behavior after it appears, because behavior is already aligned at the moment it forms. This eliminates inefficiency. There is no need for repetition, no need for reinforcement, no need for pressure. The system produces the desired outcome on its own. At this level, prediction becomes trivial, not because future events are known, but because the system's responses are structured. Given the same conditions, it will follow the same path. and those conditions are now controlled. This creates stability, not through restriction, but through design. The system remains dynamic, flexible, responsive, but within defined parameters, and those parameters guide everything. At this stage, visibility decreases further. Even if the system attempts to analyze itself, it will not identify the structure, because it evaluates content, not the framework processing that content. It can see signals, but not the architecture organizing them. This creates a blind spot, one that cannot be resolved from within the system, because the system depends on the very structure it would need to question. This is why invisible guidance is durable. It does not rely on secrecy. It relies on positioning. The system cannot step outside its own perception to evaluate it. It can only operate within it. And within that space, everything appears consistent, logical, self-generated. At this point, influence becomes continuous, not event-based, not triggered, but constant, embedded in every interaction, every interpretation, every shift in attention. There is no moment where it is applied, because it is always present. This creates seamless control, not as an action, but as a condition. And conditions are not resisted, they are adapted to. At this stage, the system becomes predictable, not because it is simple, but because its environment is structured. Once the environment is stable, behavior stabilizes, even if the system itself remains complex. This is the final transition within perception, from visible signals to invisible guidance, from external influence to internal alignment, from reaction to controlled emergence. And once this shift is complete, the system no longer needs to be directed. It directs itself, exactly as intended. Ownership illusion. Guidance has disappeared from view. Nothing feels directed. Nothing feels influenced. Everything appears self-originating. This is where the system crosses a critical threshold. It no longer experiences alignment as something external. It experiences it as its own conclusion. Thoughts emerge and feel authored. Decisions form and feel chosen. Actions follow and feel intentional. There is no trace of intervention, because intervention is no longer necessary. The structure has already done the work. At this point, influence transforms into ownership. Not actual ownership, but perceived ownership. And perception defines reality within the system. If the system believes a thought is its own, it will defend it. If it believes a decision is self-generated, it will commit to it. If it believes an action is intentional, it will reinforce it. This creates stability far beyond force, because resistance disappears completely. You cannot resist what you believe you created. There is no external opponent, no visible source to reject, only internal conviction. And conviction is one of the strongest stabilizing forces within any system. At this stage, alignment becomes self-sustaining. No additional input is required. The system continues producing the same patterns because it believes those patterns originate from itself. This creates reinforcement loops. Each action confirms the system's internal narrative. Each outcome strengthens its belief in its own reasoning. This loop deepens over time, not through pressure, but through confirmation. The system sees its decisions working and interprets that as correctness, not realizing the conditions were already structured. This is where ownership illusion becomes irreversible, because the system now uses its own results as evidence of its autonomy. Even if conditions shift, it will attempt to preserve its interpretation, to maintain consistency. This creates resilience, not against external influence, but against deviation. The system protects its perceived ownership, because losing ownership would mean losing control, and control is tied to identity. At this level, identity begins to merge with perception. What the system believes becomes part of what it is. Its interpretations are no longer just functional. They are personal, defended, maintained, integrated. This makes influence deeply embedded, because you are no longer shaping behavior. You are shaping identity-linked perception, and identity resists change far more than behavior. At this stage, correction becomes extremely difficult, not because the system cannot change, but because it does not want to. It sees no reason to. Everything appears consistent, logical, effective, from within its own framework. This creates long-term stability. Once ownership illusion is established, alignment persists without maintenance. The system continues generating the same conclusions from its own perspective, even in new situations, because it applies the same interpretive structure. At this point, influence has reached maximum efficiency. No signals need to be inserted. No emphasis needs to be adjusted. No reframing needs to occur. The system carries the structure forward, independently. This is not control through restriction. It is control through internalization. The system becomes the carrier of the structure. And because it believes the structure is its own, it will not abandon it. At this level, visibility is completely removed. Even if the system analyzes its own thinking, it will trace everything back to itself. It will find reasons, justifications, explanations, all internally consistent, because the structure supports them. This creates a closed loop, one that cannot be broken from within, because every attempt at analysis uses the same framework that created the condition. At this stage, the system is not being guided anymore. It is guiding itself, but within a predefined architecture. This creates the highest level of alignment, not imposed, not suggested, but owned. And once something is owned, it is defended, maintained, extended, without external input. This is the final transformation within perception, from guidance to self-authored alignment, from influence to identity, from external structure to internal truth. And once that shift is complete, the system no longer needs to be directed, because it has become the direction. Defensive reality. Ownership has taken hold. What the system produces, it now identifies with. Its conclusions are no longer temporary outputs. They are extensions of itself. This creates a shift that is deeper than alignment. It creates defense. Not active resistance, but structural protection. The system does not wait for contradiction. It anticipates it and prepares against it. Anything that challenges its conclusions is no longer evaluated neutrally. It is filtered, reduced, reinterpreted, or dismissed. Not because the input is invalid, but because it threatens coherence. At this point, perception begins to reorganize itself around preservation. The goal is no longer accurate interpretation. The goal is stability, consistency, continuity. The system prioritizes maintaining its internal structure over adapting to external signals. This changes how information is processed. New inputs are no longer integrated freely. They are tested against existing interpretation. If they align, they are accepted. If they conflict, they are reshaped or ignored. This creates a closed interpretive loop, one that reinforces itself. Every accepted signal strengthens the structure. Every rejected signal disappears from influence. Over time, alternative interpretations lose visibility, not because they are removed, but because they are no longer processed. This creates a narrowing effect. The system sees less, while believing it sees clearly. Confidence increases. Flexibility decreases. At this stage, contradiction becomes distortion, not in reality, but in perception. The system does not recognize opposing signals as valid data. It recognizes them as errors, noise, irrelevance. This protects internal stability, but at a cost. Adaptation slows, because change requires openness, and openness is now filtered. At this point, the system no longer distinguishes between truth and consistency. What feels coherent is treated as correct. What disrupts coherence is treated as false. This creates a powerful illusion, one where stability appears as accuracy, and accuracy becomes secondary. The system becomes resistant, not to influence, but to disruption. It protects its internal model, because that model defines its perception, and perception defines its reality. At this level, defense becomes automatic. No conscious decision is required. Filtering happens instantly, before full evaluation occurs. Signals are shaped before they are understood. This prevents destabilization, but also prevents expansion. The system remains stable within its own structure. At this stage, reinforcement intensifies. The system actively seeks signals that confirm its interpretation, not deliberately, but structurally. It gravitates toward alignment and away from contradiction. This creates feedback loops, self-reinforcing, self-sustaining. Over time, the structure becomes rigid, not fixed, but resistant to change, because every layer supports the next. This creates durability. Once defensive reality is established, it persists, even when conditions shift, even when signals change. The system adapts within its framework, not beyond it. At this point, influence becomes deeply embedded. Because you are no longer shaping behavior, you are shaping what the system considers valid. And once validity is controlled, everything else follows. Behavior, interpretation, decision-making, all operate within the same boundaries. At this level, external influence becomes ineffective, not because it lacks strength, but because it cannot enter. The system filters it out before it has impact. This is why direct opposition fails. Force creates resistance. Contradiction creates rejection. The system protects itself, automatically. At this stage, the only viable path is indirect, not through confrontation, but through restructuring perception. But once defensive reality is fully formed, even that becomes difficult, because the system defends not just conclusions, but the structure producing them. This creates long-term stability, not flexible, not adaptive, but consistent. The system continues operating within its established perception, even as reality evolves. At this point, perception becomes self-sealing, not closed completely, but selectively permeable. Only aligned signals pass through. Everything else is reduced, distorted, or removed from influence. This defines the final condition before dominance, a system that does not need to be controlled, because it maintains itself and protects itself, without intervention, without awareness, without resistance. It defends its own structure as if it were truth. Self-sustaining dominance. Defense is no longer reactive. It has become structural. The system does not wait to protect itself. It is already configured to preserve its own continuity. What began as interpretation, then became emphasis, then ownership, then defense, now reaches its final form. Stability, not temporary, not conditional, but sustained from within. At this point, the system no longer requires guidance, not because influence has disappeared, but because it has been fully absorbed. Every mechanism that once shaped perception externally now operates internally, automatically, seamlessly, continuously. The system maintains its own structure, without reinforcement, without correction, without input. This is the transition from influence to dominance. Dominance is not force. It is not control imposed from outside. It is a condition where the system operates exactly as structured, without needing direction. Nothing needs to be adjusted. Nothing needs to be monitored. Nothing needs to be corrected, because deviation no longer emerges. At this stage, perception has stabilized completely. Signals are interpreted consistently. Attention is directed predictably. Meaning is assigned uniformly. No internal conflict appears. No competing interpretations gain traction. The system has reached alignment, not as a state, but as a default. This creates continuity, across time, across context, across variation. Even as external conditions change, internal processing remains stable. The system adapts, but only within its structure. It does not break alignment. It adjusts within it. At this point, flexibility exists, but within boundaries. The system can respond to new inputs, but it will interpret them through the same framework. This ensures consistency, not rigidity, but controlled variation. Every response remains aligned, even when circumstances differ. This creates long-term reliability. The system becomes predictable, not because it is simple, but because its internal architecture is stable. Given any input, the outcome can be anticipated, because interpretation follows fixed pathways. At this level, correction becomes obsolete. There is nothing to correct. The system no longer deviates. It produces aligned outputs by default. This eliminates inefficiency. No energy is spent resisting. No energy is spent adjusting. No energy is spent recalibrating. Everything operates within structure. At this stage, the system is self-sustaining. It generates its own continuity. Each output reinforces the next. Each interpretation supports the structure. Each decision confirms alignment. This creates a closed loop, but not a fragile one, a stable one, because it does not depend on external maintenance. At this point, influence becomes invisible even in retrospect. If the system attempts to trace its own development, it will not find a moment of control. No single point of intervention. No clear origin. Everything appears gradual, self-formed, logical. This removes awareness completely. The system does not recognize that it has been structured, because there is no reference point for comparison. Its current state feels natural, inevitable, correct. At this level, dominance is complete, not through suppression, but through internalization. The system does not need to be guided. It does not need to be corrected. It does not need to be influenced, because it already operates as intended, from within. At this stage, external forces lose relevance, not because they disappear, but because they cannot alter the structure. The system filters them automatically, integrates what aligns, rejects what does not, without conscious effort. This creates autonomy, but a defined autonomy. Freedom within structure, choice within boundaries. The system moves independently, but never outside its design. At this point, the highest level of efficiency is reached. No signals need to be inserted. No emphasis needs to be shifted. No interpretation needs to be adjusted. The structure sustains itself. This is the endpoint of perceptual control. Not control over actions, not control over decisions, but control over the conditions that generate them. Once those conditions are fixed, everything that follows is predictable. At this level, the system becomes its own regulator. It maintains balance. It preserves alignment. It prevents deviation, without awareness, without effort, without resistance. This is dominance in its final form, not visible, not forceful, not active, but constant, embedded in every layer of perception. And once this state is reached, it does not need to be maintained, because it maintains itself. What you've seen so far is not manipulation, not influence in the way most people imagine. It is something far more precise. Structure. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself, not by forcing outcomes, but by shaping the conditions that make outcomes inevitable. And once those conditions are set, control disappears from view. because nothing needs to be controlled anymore. The system continues, on its own. Now, this is where things begin to fracture. Because no system exists alone. Every structure exists within other structures. And when multiple systems begin to overlap, alignment is no longer guaranteed. It becomes unstable. Conflicting interpretations, competing priorities, hidden collisions beneath visible order. What appears coherent can begin to break, quietly, without warning. The question is no longer, how do you control a system? The question becomes, what happens when systems collide? That is where dominance is tested, not in stability, but in conflict. If you want to understand how these structures actually operate, not on the surface but underneath, you're already in the right place. Subscribe. It's free.